between the 1970s and the 1990s, malaria makes a major comeback. And it's in response to that that you get a number of countries who are dealing with malaria calling for greater international involvement and a series of conferences, which leads to the development of a new set of programs in the early 90s around what becomes known as rollback malaria. The difference between rollback malaria and the earlier eradication campaign had to do with, one, a different set of strategies being employed to control malaria. Secondly, that it was not just WHO leadership, WHO, UNICEF, which had run the eradication campaign, but a whole range of organizations, including the World Bank, UNDP, UNICEF, and a number of bilateral organizations, NGOs. And so it was a lot larger grouping of organizations involved, and there was a lot more money involved. And the amounts of money rose dramatically from the early 90s, when about $60–80 million worldwide was being spent on malaria control, to now where we're up to $3.5–4 billion has been raised. Along the way, the Gates Foundation comes along and pitches in, and you get the Global Fund for Malaria Eradication, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. And so we really have scaled up dramatically in terms of trying to bring malaria under control, to the point where Bill Gates and others have begun talking about the possibility of eradication yet again. Whether that's feasible or not is highly debatable, but nonetheless it reflects the degree to which there have been dramatic successes, mostly around the use of bed nets, the success they've had controlling falciparum malaria with ACTs, and different programs for intervening in malaria in pregnancy, and intervening rapidly in emergency situations such as associated with refugee populations. And they've reintroduced something which was not part of the original rollback malaria program, insecticides and residual insecticide spraying of pots, and basically as a result of protests of many countries that had been using it effectively but had not been part of the original rollback malaria schemes. Even the most efficient government can't necessarily control malaria. So malaria was a recurrent problem in Rome, in the city of Rome. And it came in the summer, and it came with the breeding of the mosquitoes and infecting people. On the other hand, it's clear that disruption, political disruption and economic disruption, the destruction of farming lands, anything which disrupts the ecology of the region, which provides more opportunities for the malaria vectors to breed, is going to in fact increase the occurrence of the disease. More recently, there are lots of episodes where you can see where violence and civil war has contributed to the rise of malaria, disrupting populations, leading to population movements, people fleeing areas and moving to areas, either coming from an area where there is malaria to an area where there's not malaria and leading to its reintroduction or introduction to an area, or people coming from an area where there's no malaria and going to an area where there is malaria and becoming infected. Refugees are a major problem in terms of malaria, or malaria is a major problem for refugee populations in many parts of the globe. So political stability doesn't necessarily ensure that there's not going to be malaria historically, but it's certainly true that political disruptions have been associated with its occurrence. I think once, in fact, you move into the second half of the 20th century, when you actually have effective instruments for controlling, or even in the earlier parts of the 20th century, where there are ways in which malaria can be controlled by eliminating breeding sites, eliminating vectors, then political disruption and not having effective government can be a very important player in the epidemiology of the disease, because those kinds of control measures require some sort of oversight. And while there are debates about how centralized control measures need to be, clearly the absence of organized political infrastructure tends to discourage the development of effective control measures. And you can see places where in a country like Nicaragua, for example, in the 1970s, where you had very effective control measures going in, or 1980s, very effective control measures going on in parts of the country, but in neighboring parts of the country where there was civil war going on, that in fact all those control measures crumbled down and there was increases in malaria. So political stability plays a very important role, certainly since over the last 100 years. There are dramatic successes that have occurred. The real question for me is how long this can be sustained. Will there be the support that is needed to maintain the levels of control that are required to meet the goals that have been set forth by rollback malaria? And once those goals are achieved, which at the current time is not eradication, but bringing malaria down to very low levels, whether you can sustain that control. Unfortunately, the history of international support for these kinds of programs does not suggest that donors will continue supporting this forever. And we saw what happened after the global eradication program was withdrawn, and malaria support financially dropped off, and malaria came back. Malaria is not something you can turn your back on. Small numbers of cases can rapidly result in large number of cases and large number of fatalities. So there's a real issue of sustainability and how that can be achieved. My sense is that we have to develop the countries that are actually at risk of malaria in ways that allow them to have the resources they need to control the disease, and that they will no longer be dependent on international aid and support for these programs. That's going to take time, but if we don't start, you're never going to get to that point. Now, there may come a time when there's a vaccine that'll come along and all this will go away. But I don't know anyone, and there's a huge institute across the street that's working on malaria vaccine and medicines. I don't know anyone over there that really believes that the vaccine will be like smallpox vaccine. It'll be a vaccine that'll be one more weapon in the armaments and will protect young children and maybe more, but it's not going to be an end to the problem. So I think we're still going to be faced with the issue of how we're going to maintain control and where the resources are going to come from. I mean, ultimately, you want people to be able to go down to their local drugstore or equivalent and buy what they need to protect themselves. Right now, the resources don't exist in many parts of the world, and certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, for that to happen. So, not without massive subsidies. So, we've got to find ways in which that can happen.